on our night of ideas. I think it's been fascinating so far. We've only had one major panel in here and the opening address, but the ideas are fizzing around the building on how we're going to rebuild together, how we're going to rebuild this broken world. So many good ideas, so many strong ideas, some controversial, some far-fetched, some hopefully will take root, and some will be productive. I think hope is springing from so far what we're hearing amid the rubble of ideas. Our next panel is called What's Essential. We're going to get really down to what matters, what's essential. I always thought that essential oils are one of the least essential things that you could possibly have. But we'll discover what is really essential. I think the pandemic and the lockdown has brought us all back to basics to discover what's really essential. We've got a fascinating panel of people who've been thinking about this on the personal realm, the political realm, and in terms of the physical and the metaphysical. So I think it's going to be an absolutely fascinating panel. Would you please welcome to the stage the chair of the panel, Agnès Poirier. Here she is. Her book about Notre Dame, the soul of a nation. You're the chair, so I think over there, please. Her book is on sale downstairs. Very good value. And would you please welcome the writer Elif Shafak. Elif, fantastic. Her book, The Island of Missing Trees, is also on sale downstairs. It's also fantastic. You see? There you go. I paid her £5 to say that. We also have with us in the room Tim Waterman, ladies and gentlemen. He does have a book coming as well. Just in case you felt left out, he does have a book coming, but I don't know if it's on sale downstairs. What's your new book?
The Landscape of Utopia.
The Landscape of Utopia. See, everyone's got a book. I feel terrible. I haven't got a book. I've got a pamphlet. And remotely, we have Timothée Parrique, if he's there. Timothée, bonsoir. Hello.
Bonsoir.
Hello. Do you have a book?
I do have a book, but it will only come out in October.
Okay, well, that's good. That's better than me. Not only do we have authors here, ladies and gentlemen, we have tonight with us a roving poet. Before every panel, we have a poet, a chorus, if you like, to comment on the action, like a Greek tragedy. Well, I hope it's not a tragedy. Something like a Greek chorus, anyway. He is, in fact, born in Cyprus. So would you please welcome to the stage for a poem based on what's essential, Anthony Anaxagoru. Hi, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. I wrote this poem that was inspired by the experience of the lockdown, and it's entitled "What's Essential." What a time to be alive, the old lodger kept saying. News hounding like an air raid warning. I pressed my face against the warmest chunk of wall, asking if he needed any new supplies. I'm here too, I muttered, turning the news off, turning my phone down, shaking the fridge, saying, hang in there, little buddy, we're all a bit emptier now. Allowing the rice to boil over as it wishes, my windows offering nothing. Mum, forget the garden today, let April do the work for us. News bulletins report it's on the up. 45 claims he's on the up. Tonight, we'll sleep inside our new damage, waving at each other through screens and surgery masks, like kids in an operating theatre. Wow, loneliness needs us now more than ever. The lady upstairs, I'm sure she's there, her babies too. Nobody around here has seen the ground in weeks, in months, years from now, we'll still be running. Thanks.
Anthony Anaxagoru. And with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy, he also has a book on sale downstairs. I'll leave you in the very capable hands of this extraordinary panel to find out what's essential. Tales from Lockdown, Agnès Poirier, Elif Shafak, Timothée Parrique, and Tim Waterman. And I'll see you in about 50 minutes.
Thank you, Jason. And Jason actually is the author of a book, very good book, on Woody Allen. Is it on sale?
No,
there?
You know what? It's sold out. Sold out.
So it's very good. Well, I'm very happy to be here and to see you all in the flesh. I remember a year ago, I was alone on stage with Philippe Sands and just the people from the French Institute, and it was such a lovely but also very eerie, spooky experience. So, how is it going to work? All of my guests are going to, or every one of them are going to do a sort of an introduction, a little speech, and then we'll just discuss, something very, very big subject, what's essential in life, especially after our experience of the pandemic. And then we'll take questions from you. So I'm going to ask Tim first, Tim Waterman, to tell us what's essential.
Excellent.
Start telling us.
Okay, I can start right now. Thank you, Agnès, and thank you to this wonderful organization and this wonderful venue. It's great to be in this building that I've admired for so long. So, what's essential? Asking good questions, I think, is the most essential thing that we can do. And I'm very much inspired by the philosopher of science, Isabelle Stengers, who writes in her book, Cosmopolitics. She says, we must begin by reinventing questions wherever we've been converted to believing in the power of answers. This is because the way that we frame answers and the way that we seek to achieve them in the world now is shaped by the common sense of our age. And a lot of the common sense of our age is very, very limiting, takes us down a very, very narrow path. So there's the idea of presentism, that we're stuck in a somehow nihilistic present. And you could say that people like Margaret Thatcher sort of took us there with the idea that economic liberalism is inevitable and the future of humankind. She even said, there is no alternative. Tina was one of her slogans. So no reference to a past other than an immobile one, and no reference to a future other than the narrow one to which we're directed by economic forces of the present. Competitive individualism is the next force that drives us. The idea that we live in a dog-eat-dog world, the idea that we're each atomic and alone and individual, which the pandemic, I think, made us feel in many ways like that was the case, but it also helped us to feel how important it was to be together. Then the issue of antagonistic binaries, which we're so driven to by social media, that there's no middle ground for discussion, that we map our arguments onto very distant poles, and we can't meet in the middle. And then finally, the idea of solutionism, which is just as magical as the idea of a kind of a capitalistic future, is that somehow we've come to believe that there are simple technical solutions to very complex problems in life. So I think all of this that takes us down a very, very narrow track, which we often call teleology, right? This is the idea that we're drawn into progress inevitably towards a telos, and this is pulling us into the future, and that's our idea of progress. Working in utopian studies as I do, amazingly this is a field, and it's a delightful field. It's about imagining the future in rich ways. We don't talk about a telos as much as we talk about a horizon of expectation. So this is not something you're pulled towards, but rather something you're reaching towards. And it's a horizon, so there are lots of possibilities. And actually, the imaginaries of fiction allow us, the privileges of fiction allow us to reach towards those possible horizons. And those possible horizons also allow us to give voice not to the negative, not to addressing inequality or injustice, but actually to talk specifically about what is equality, what is justice, what is freedom, how do we practice it, and how do we give it to each other? How do we give it to each other every day in the space of the street and in the spaces where we live? So this is also a utopian mode. And it's about stories. It's about the stories we tell about the lives we live, and it's about the stories we tell about who we are in the places that we are. So I think the process of asking is a utopian one, because it's also a process of desiring, of hoping. And that's fundamental to raising questions. Questions also involve a quest. And a quest is a journey. A quest is a set of challenges and situations. And in literature, it's almost never the goal that's the interesting thing. It's always the getting there that's the interesting thing. And that's where all of the ethical questions are that arise, that engage us so much. It's everything along the way, ethical situations, the richness of places and of characters. So this ethical context for me, the other field I work in other than utopian studies is landscape studies. And landscape studies is about being situated. It's about being in a place. And stories take place in places, in landscapes, between people, and they're about relationships. So I like to think of landscapes not as the scenography of power, but rather as landship, as that which makes us and we make it. So it's a relationship between people and place that's mutually constitutive. So good questions arise from these kind of settings. They arrive from milieus, from a place where relationships occur. And good questions also don't provide answers or plans or solutions necessarily, as much as they provide us with readiness. And maybe that's more what we need to face the future. We need knowledge for readiness. We need mutual aid. We need tools for thinking. We need scenario making for better worlds, for world making. And we need care.
Thank you very much, Tim. And so I don't know if Timothée is still with us. Yes. Timothée, can you tell us what you'd like to say as an introduction?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So we often think of the economy as something outside of our control, like a living creature with a will of its own. But actually, my point is that the economy is more like a game we play. And like any game, it has rules. So at the moment, the golden rule of our economy is make as much money as possible. This is true whether you're an individual trying to increase your income, a firm striving to make a profit, or a government pursuing GDP at all costs. For all participants involved, the accumulation of money is good. This is what's essential. And we became so obsessed with this rule over time that it became the objective of the game. Grow the economy, amass GDP points. And in doing so, we forgot the very purpose of having an economy. An economy should provide for the needs of everyone. And of course, and it's in the name, it should economize resources. Paradoxically, the goal of an economy is to minimize its own existence. Nobody wants to play the game of economy all the time, and nobody should, because there's more to life than just the economy. A performant economy should liberate time for scientific, artistic, spiritual, and political activities, among many other non-economic things. It should enable us to leave as much of nature safely untouched and as much of our time joyfully unworked. This is what should be essential. But this is not the case today. We have an economic system that is organized around the pursuit of monetary accumulation, and therefore that is blind to most of what matters in life. GDP doesn't make the difference between the goods and the bads, it just measures economic agitation, regardless of whether this agitation is necessary, fair, or sustainable. So you might say the indicator is silly, but it's just a mean to achieve greater things. It is not anymore. Because beyond a certain threshold of GDP per capita, income completely ceases to correlate with happiness, health, education, trust, political engagement. In rich countries, we grow our economies without ending poverty, GDP is up, but society is down. And to add injury to insult, the more an economy grows, the more it destroys the living systems that support its very existence. Some people like to talk of a green growth, but that's a scam. All the scientific evidence shows that economic growth is still heavily coupled with various forms of environmental degradation. Calling the growth of rich countries green is stretching the word beyond any useful meaning. There is very little that is green about growth. Our fast and furious, biophysically obese capitalist economies are leading most of the world, starting with the most vulnerable, to a social ecological disaster. So we need to ditch this mystique of growth and remember that the growth game was built a long time ago, a time of war, reconstruction, and back at the time we thought infinite supplies of natural resources. But the growth game is unfit for the 21st century. We need new rules. And here comes COVID. And for the first time in modern history, the money game stopped. For once, we gave up abstract figures of GDP and focused on what matters, concrete needs. Suddenly, we realized that the lavishly paid marketers of luxury brands were not performing any useful work. And we also realized that the people who did hold the economy together happened to be the least rewarded for the labor. We realized protecting people from falling into poverty was more important than a random level of public deficit. And then keeping people alive was more important than reassuring financial markets. During the pandemic, we got a reminder that the economy has been socially constructed and can therefore be deconstructed and reconstructed. It's only a game we made. Now, let's remember this precious insight in our fight against climate breakdown and the collapse of biodiversity. Let's stop worrying over money points and let's look at what matters, whether you want to call it well-being, health, sustainability, or anything else. This is not only urgent, but also very exciting. For too long, we've been focused on predicting the future of the economy. But today, time to turn things around and instead invent the economy of the future. I'm very much looking forward to discuss this with you.
Thank you, Timothée. And now to you, Elif.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure for me to share this stage with all of you. But also, especially on this day, today is the Holocaust Memorial Day. And I think it's important for us to ask this question, what is essential, especially on a day like this? So if you'll allow me, I want to start with that. I think memory is essential. To remember is essential. Because we tend to think, and some of what I'm going to say will overlap with what has been pointed out, we tend to think that time is linear, that it's always progressive, that tomorrow has to be more developed, advanced than yesterday. You know, we have this linear concept of time, which is an illusion. In fact, there's no guarantee that societies will always go forward. There's no guarantee that the arc of history is going to bend towards justice. You know, all of that is what we tell ourselves, but there's no such guarantee. And I think it is actually possible that societies can go backwards and generations can make the same mistakes that their great-grandparents had already made. So in a way, we can go in a more circular way. And I think if this is true, if history is not necessarily linear, if time is not necessarily progressive, I think we women need to be more concerned. Because when societies go backwards, the first rights that will be taken away and will be curbed and curtailed will be women's rights. And it will be minority rights. So I think we are at a critical crossroads in which I like that, you know, the Italian political thinker Antonio Gramsci used to write about this. The old world is gone, it is no more, but the new world is not born yet. And we are in the middle, we are in this threshold moment which is so scary because it's full of uncertainties. And I think it's also a dangerous moment because this is precisely when the demagogues enter into the picture. Because they promise us simplicity. They say, you know, leave it to me. I'm going to make things simple for you. But I think that's a lie. You know, the world we're living in is a complex world. And to me, it makes more sense to understand that as human beings, we're all interconnected. So much so that a virus that originates in one part of the world can change, can affect the lives and livelihoods of people living continents away, miles away. I mean, the pandemic has shown it so clearly that we are interconnected. The climate destruction has shown it clearly that we are interconnected. But as if none of that is happening, where we have ended up is nationalism, vaccine nationalism. You know, while richer countries are hoarding more vaccines, huge chunks of population in Africa, in South America, across Asia, people do not have access to vaccines. So what matters, what is essential, I think inequalities matter. And the reason why I use it plural is because they're all related. Whether it's racial inequality, gender inequality, or regional or digital inequality, if we care about climate destruction, I think we also should care about gender inequality. Because every study shows that so far, millions of people who have been displaced or about to be displaced because of climate change, most of them, the ones who are worst affected are women and children. We also know that at times of chaotic change, there will be an increase in gender violence and also violence against LGBTQ+ communities. So all these issues are interconnected. What is essential is that we can't be single issue people. We need to see connections. I think it's also essential to understand that we need a new narrative. You know, we need to celebrate diversity, multiplicity. Unfortunately, we're living at a time of populist nationalism, and the rhetoric that is on the rise is about this singular definition of identity, as if we can each only belong in one box and one box only, you know? We are being told by politicians that if you're a citizen of the world, then it means you're a citizen of nowhere. I think that's nonsense. You know, we're all citizens of the world. We're all citizens of humanity. That doesn't mean you don't love the country where you come from. It doesn't mean you don't have any connection to your cultural ancestors. We can be, and we are, multiple things at once. So what is essential for me is to reinforce local connections, regional connections, and international, global. Why can't we think of identity as more fluid? Like water, ripples in water, you know, concentric circles. That to me is essential. And if I may finish on this note, I think, you know, I wanted to start with the Holocaust. When you read the memoirs of people who have survived the darkest chapters in human history, including genocides, civil wars, there's one question that the survivors are asking each other and asking us, therefore, how come these things happen? How come human beings are capable of inflicting so much hurt, so much pain on each other? Is it because we're evil by nature, or, you know, we carry it inherently? But the answer that the survivors are giving is not that. They're saying, yes, there are some evil people, but relatively their numbers are small. Whereas the atrocities or the problems that we're talking about is happening at a massive level. So how do you explain that? And I think the answer that they're giving us is maybe the opposite of good is not necessarily bad. Maybe the opposite of kindness is not necessarily wickedness. Maybe the opposite of good is actually numbness, you know, the moment we become indifferent, desensitized, disconnected. And I think that is a very dangerous world to live in. So the age we live in, I call the age of anxiety, but I think it will be a much harder world to live in if it turns into an age of apathy. The moment we stop sharing, the moment we stop caring and, you know, listening to each other. So what is essential, I want to finish on that note, is not to lose these connections and to keep talking and to keep listening to each other and to believe that we can create a better world if we are more connected and if we understand the importance of equality, inclusion, and diversity.
Thank you very much, Elif. So I'd like to start our discussion with a personal question, because we'll be dealing with big ideas, but also I want to to know for each of you, I'll start with Tim, how did you feel about lockdown? Was it glorious? Was it terrible? And what lessons did you come to? I mean, personally.
Maybe two things in particular come to mind. My husband and I live in central London, so we're used to it being incredibly bustling. And it was the most empty part of town. You know, we had to go up to Islington to see people on the streets. There was literally no one in central London. But it made me think of the fact that almost exactly 100 years ago, cars were just coming into the space of the street. And of course, there was all this protest about, there were, you know, joyriding was happening and children were getting run over in the streets, and there were huge public protests about the incursion of cars into the space of the street. So it gave me the opportunity really to think about that, and actually to walk down the middle of the street and look at buildings as they're meant to be seen in the city. That was exciting. And then the other thing I think that was particularly poignant was our government didn't expect people to be trustworthy. They didn't expect people to look out for each other, and yet everyone did in really phenomenal ways that then our government had to go out of its way to destroy that trust, to return us to this kind of system of competitive individualism. And I really do honestly think that that was a calculated measure to break down the trust and that mutual spirit that was so evident in the wake of the pandemic.
You think it's not evident anymore?
Oh, I think it is. In fact, I think it just took so much work to try to break that apart, and yet it's still so evident that people can be trusted and will look out for each other as a general rule.
And will obey the rules.
And will obey the rules, because they're mutual rules. They're about helping each other out, and we do that as a species.
So it was, you know, good things out of it, of your pandemics. The landscape, nobody in the streets, looking at the architecture, which is one of your specialty, the way it should be looked at, and also that solidarity, you know, that you're talking about.
Yeah, not so good to experience, but good lessons.
Okay.
Good lessons.
So it means no more cars in your book, if we want to enjoy the city.
Well, I mean, that's a difficult one too, because I think we need vehicles in the city. We need fire engines, we need lorries to come in and take away the rubbish. But I think the personal motor car is something that everyone really began to question seriously. And of course, you see the backlash now with people, you know, trying to get rid of bike lanes and things like that. So we're seeing a very typical kind of backlash against forms of mutual feeling and mutual care in public space. That's quite common. It happens regularly, almost on a cycle.
Timothée, can you tell us about your experience in the pandemic, the lockdown, and the lessons you came to for yourself?
Of course. The timing for me was a bit strange because I finished my PhD thesis on March 5th, 2020. And I concluded the thesis back then, which I had written in December 2019, with a thought experiment inviting readers that in 1 year exactly, the economy was just going to stop. And we were all going to be just, you know, confronted with the task of reorganizing the economy. So for me, I published a thesis on March 5th, ready to, you know, spend a good 6 months of holidays, surfing somewhere, climbing elsewhere. And it doesn't happen. So I find myself confined in the countryside in Versailles, France, where my family is from. And somehow I found myself locked within my own work, which was on degrowth and the ecological crisis and the role played by economic growth in the ecological crisis. And so I find myself not being able to escape that idea. And I'm not sure that's a lesson, but it was a very strange feeling, because as much as the moment was urgent and, you know, the health situation demanded urgent action and everything accelerated on that side, but many other things slowed down very much. So I kind of felt like an analytical Flash Gordon. All of a sudden, everything went very slow. And I felt for the first time since the time I started to study political economy, I was able almost to look at the functioning of an economy in slow motion. So for me, and that's what inspired my little contribution in the speech, that the first time I could watch the game of economy from the outside, a bit like Jumanji, and for the first time I realized, oh wow, that economy we've been in that never been stopped, it's actually clockwork. You know, someone can switch off the button and everything has a button. So that was my lesson. I think that quite empowered me to that everything is possible, when things that we thought were economic laws were not actually laws, like laws of physics or biology, that the economy is a bit like Legos. You know, we've been building it one way, but we can unbuild it and rebuild it any way we see possible.
Thank you. What about you, Elif? Were you in London?
I was in London, yeah, throughout the lockdowns. I wish I could say the pandemic. We're still going through that tunnel, of course. But we were talking about this earlier. At the very beginning of the lockdown, there were some tweets, messages from publishers with good intentions saying this won't be a huge difference for authors, because writers are solitary creatures. They don't do teamwork. You know, they work on their own anyway. They work from home anyway. So the lockdown won't be a huge difference for authors. And that wasn't my experience at all. Actually, it was a big difference. And I think it's like an existential angst. We are not disconnected. We are not outside of the societies we live in. And it affects us, of course. And there's a moment when you ask yourself, is this what I should be doing right now? You know, does it really matter if I find the perfect synonym? If I move that comma from here to the next sentence? Is that what I should be doing right now, when so much is happening outside the window, when people are dying, when there's so much uncertainty? So you do question. That's what I experienced. And I wrote a little booklet throughout the pandemic. It's called How to Stay Sane in an Age of Division. In a way, that was a bit like my answer to that moment in time. Doris Lessing has a beautiful essay in which she says, literature is always analysis after the event. You know, things happen, and then you need to give some time for writers to digest, to absorb. In that regard, all writing is in retrospect. I understand that, and I respect that. However, I think we've entered an age in which literature also has to become analysis during the event, not only after the event, but whilst things are happening, we have to respond. So it was a bit like my own little attempt to understand my own emotions, whether it's anxiety, fear, anger, confusion, because I think we're all dealing with lots of seemingly negative emotions. And the crucial question is, of course, is they're all a raw source of energy. You know, can we turn it into something more positive, constructive, both for ourselves, but also for our communities and societies? But for that to happen, I think we need to talk about emotions, which is a subject which is usually a bit underestimated in political discussions.
So you turned to non-fiction for the first time to actually deal with it.
Yeah.
But is there a pandemic novel in you?
There are actually pandemic novels coming out right now, written by amazing authors. In a way, the novel that I wrote, The Island of Missing Trees, even though it's not a pandemic novel, it is a novel that very much celebrates nature, particularly trees, the idea of being connected. So it did shape, even though I started writing that novel and I finished during the pandemic, this moment in time does shape the way we write, and it will change, in my opinion, the art of storytelling.
So you just mentioned trees and your latest book, and you mentioned landscape. And Timothée was talking about being in Versailles, where there are a lot of trees. Or we could start, I mean, what's essential, you know, for people it was eating well or drinking. but also rekindling, I think, with nature was huge for a lot of people. And then they decided that they would leave the cities and go to the country, etc. Is it being, Tim, is it something that in your field, is it a new thing, redesigning perhaps the city? And because we have environmental issues, is it, you know, is it happening? Is it going to happen? This, you know, the fact that we need nature much more than we thought perhaps we needed it.
I mentioned briefly that landscape is about relationships. So landscape design and landscape architecture is where I was trained. Many people think that's just about gardens, wonderful as gardens are, but it really is about landscapes at the regional scale. It's about negotiating across continents even. Landscape architecture is really even looking at, you know, the oceans now and the way that they connect people across the world. So I think the pandemic really highlighted the importance of relationships, and not just human relationships, but the relationship that we have with urban space, the relationship that we have with green space. And from a landscape perspective, you can see the city as a landscape, you can see the city as a set of relationships, and when you begin to set yourself in the middle of the milieu, it becomes a conversation rather than a set of solutions. And this is why I'm so passionate about not addressing solutions, because the way that we've tended to approach the space of the city and the space of the landscape is to say, I have an answer, bam, it's done. And yet the approach that we need to take is far more about ongoing care and maintenance. It's about learning to see the relationships that are before you and then work with them. So, and I think Timothée might kind of agree here, is that the idea of development isn't necessarily about economic development, but actually it's about making a better world for people and helping that world fit them better. So all of these questions about access to green space and use of the space of the street and such, I think has been hugely present to me in my work over the last couple of years.
And Timothée, you have a PhD, you're social scientist, that's the word I was looking for. How do you think the economy is going to adapt to how, working from home and also working, so many people now try to divide their time between the city and perhaps the country to be closer to nature. This is really a trend that is happening. How will the economy adapt, or do we need to just, to impose it on the government and just, as you vote with your feet, you work with your feet? What's your perspective on that?
There's been an incredibly valuable discussion happening there during the pandemic, and that was the division between what needs and wants, between what's essential and superfluous. I remember you could go to the French supermarket and you could buy food, but there was just some red tape on toys and video games and anything else, and it was forbidden by law to buy these goods. So of course that was a bit clumsy, but here we touched a radical, fundamental question of political economy, which is to rethink the value of things. And we've lost the habit of doing this, because with a model of development where we only count money points, we tend to value cutting a tree rather than having it alive and being in resonance with the tree and developing relation with the tree, because developing a relationship with the tree is not going to give you money, it's not going to increase your GDP, but if you cut it and sell it as wood, it does. So I think now, as individually, during the pandemic, we had for the first time to make that very important decision, like, is my work important enough for me to take the risk of spreading the virus among people? And so, I don't know, I was making fun of marketers for luxury brands, but perhaps if you're a nurse, of someone working in a farmer or anything, okay, I need to go to work. It's very important. I'll take the risk of contaminating people. But if you're working in marketing, perhaps you question yourself and be like, well, my work is not worth the risk. And now I wish we could ask the same question more globally about climate change, for example, realizing that some of our jobs are just involving too much ecological risk for not much social reward. And we see this already in our generation, and the lying flat movement in China, for example, youngsters that just refuse to partake in that rat race of expensive studies to lead you to high wage jobs. What they want is find an activity that resonates with their passion and aspiration. So I do hope that people will take this into account, and where you work and how that connect with where you live is an important part of that.
Thank you, Timothée. We're running out of time, and I'm sure you have questions for Tim, Elif, and Timothée. So can you, I think there's a mic.
Hi, it's been nice to hear you all speak. So I'm someone who's interested in urbanism and degrowth. However, I feel like I've got a slightly different narrative as to what lockdown meant for many people. Personally, I feel like lockdown was a disaster for urbanism in particular. Currently, public transport use is down by 60%, whereas usage of the roads and private cars is up to where it was pre-lockdown. Partially, in my opinion, it's because people lost trust in the ability for society to protect themselves from the pandemic. People don't trust each other to not transmit the virus. They don't share public transport spaces with them. Instead, used car prices have gone up through the roof because there's so much demand. To bolster that, we've lost cultural institutions because of lack of funding over the course of the pandemic during lockdown, and that's been quite profound. I mean, major institutions have survived, but smaller institutions, smaller, spaces like clubs and bars and small galleries, they've disappeared and they've been replaced by, costas and housing through permitted development, all this sort of stuff. And a similar story with degrowth. In one sense, yes, we stopped the economy for a bit and we didn't seem to see any sort of major implications. At the same time, without really knowing, millions of people got plunged into precarity and they never really came back, particularly people who are self-employed, people who were laid off from airlines. And obviously, as someone who's invested in sort of climate justice, it's nice to see planes grounded and to see, the sort of climate economy start to recover a bit from that. But you have to ask, what's the human cost that we're willing to accept in order to have a radical degrowth movement? How many people are we willing to, perhaps plunge into homelessness, or make them lose their jobs, make them lose their lifestyles in order to achieve these goals? Beyond that, I think for many, lockdown reaffirmed that the most essential thing is to be able to survive. And many people gave up hobbies and interests and all that sort of stuff in order to be able to put food on the table. And I think this is an essential alternative narrative that outside of people being able to transfer between cities and countryside or perhaps live in central London, if you go to sort of greater London and places like Enfield or Ilford or Croydon, I don't think this narrative has quite hit those sort of areas. And I think it's important to talk about that as well.
And do you want to ask a question to Timothée?
Well, I guess come back to that question of how do you navigate the cost of precarity? How do you navigate, the sort of the balancing of putting people into precarious positions versus achieving, radical degrowth goals?
Did you get that, Timothée?
Yes, I did. Thanks for the question. So to be clear, I'm not celebrating the pandemic in any kind, nor do I associate either the pandemic, the lockdown, or the recession that followed with degrowth, which is studied as a planned and democratic reduction of production and consumption in rich countries to lower environmental pressures and inequality while improving well-being. So what we've lived during the pandemic has nothing to do with degrowth as a paradigm, as a societal project. So a call for a different economy. So my intervention here is, what happened during the pandemic is, I think, is unlocking possibilities for us both to realize the unsustainability of capitalism. And I locate, the pandemic as the outcome of an ecological crisis, of an unsustainable relation we have with nature that is mediated by a predatory economic system. So we realized this could not longer go. But before, we had been stuck, and Tim was saying it very well, into presentism. We could not imagine the end of capitalism. Now with the pandemic, I think we can. Not only we think that we should, but now we see, we've been modifying so many structural rules that we have upheld at almost wholly, like, public deficits and what else. So now what I'm celebrating is our renewed capacity to imagine, post-growth, post-capitalist economies. But you're absolutely right. The difficulty is not to navigate what Elif was referring, the Gramscian monsters that lay between the not yet dead system and the not yet born one. Those monsters, take many forms, starting with, unemployment and poverty and inequality and many political dangers. So we have to navigate those, but I think we have no choice but to just make the journey. We know that there's no return possible to normal.
Thank you, Timothée. Is there a question here on the first row? Yes, I think so. Oh, there's another question there. Okay, so we'll take two.
Thank you for your insights. I also have a background in urbanism, but I wanted to ask you the things that you consider essential. So things like nature, things like human connection that you have all stated. Do you see the future of that as kind of putting the value of those things in economic terms and navigating the current system? So with things like natural capital accounting for nature and cities, or do you see it as dismantling the system, as Timothée was saying?
Elif, and then Tim on that.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. Of course, one of the things that we've been asking ourselves, again with good intentions, was when are we going to go back to the normal, the way things were before? But actually it wasn't normal, the world that we were living before the pandemic, and we're not going back, and we shouldn't. So it is a critical crossroads, and it's a time of learning, it's a time of questioning, and it's also a time in which we realize that the most essential things in life are actually immaterial things. Suddenly, once again, or perhaps we have understood the importance of family and friendships and sisterhood, or just sitting under a tree. All these things that don't have a price tag on them, they became more important. But my worry is we quickly go back to our old habits. So this was actually a golden opportunity for us to shed, to discard all kinds of racism, xenophobia, tribalism. Because at the moment of pandemic, especially if you remember the early days of the pandemic, when everybody was going through so much uncertainty and fear, you don't know, if you're hospitalized, the doctor who's going to save your life, or the nurse who's going to save your life, or the ambulance driver who takes you there. Maybe one of them is gay, maybe the doctor is Muslim, maybe the nurse is Jewish. You don't know. There was this moment in which we could really discard all kinds of discrimination, stereotypes, and start seeing our fellow human beings with a completely new light, with a new perspective. But we abandoned that moment. We clapped for the nurses, we recognized the contribution of essential workers, we recognized for a little while the contribution of immigrants in our society, and then we went back to our old habits. So that zigzag is something that worries me. I think in a nutshell, I see two trends happening simultaneously. Yes, on the one hand, we are questioning what's essential, what kind of societies do we want, what kind of life do we want, and what kind of a world do we want to leave to the next generations. And these are important questions. But on the other hand, the inequalities, as we are speaking, they're widening. The 1%, the people who are already very rich, making even more extreme profits. So we're not living at a time in which the gap is narrowing, just the opposite. So are we really learning from the pandemic? I'm not sure. And this is why we need these cultural spaces. because you were earlier referring to knowledge. I so agree. I mean, information, knowledge, and wisdom, I think they're completely different things. And we live in a world that puts too much emphasis on information. We're bombarded by information, but it doesn't help. We have to put more emphasis on knowledge, hopefully on wisdom, but we have to have new conversations. And for this, I think we need more cultural conversations.
Tim, do you want to add the last word? Because we need to finish now.
Just very quickly, I think that one of the things that happened during the lockdown is I had a lot of wonderful conversations with the Polish feminist philosopher Ewa Majewska, whose new book, which is called Feminist Anti-Fascism, addresses two things very directly. One is the issue of solidarity, and the other is the idea of translation, which she says are both crucial to the social contract and foundational to democracy, and they are never the starting point, and they should be.
And we'll take your question, but we need to leave the stage. No, we need to... Okay, so just shout.
During and since the pandemic, there is a lot of evidence that intolerance toward people with disabilities, the attitude toward older people as expendable during the pandemic, a lot of older people died. I have witnessed some nastiness and experienced as a person with disabilities. I'm visually impaired, and heard this that thank you. I'm just saying that the attitude toward people with disabilities during and since the pandemic is rock bottom and nasty. There's been a lot of abuse and intolerance toward older people as expendable. You know, there's limited funds. You know, it's going to go toward COVID. It's not going to go toward elderly, and so a lot of older people have died. And you know what's happened in in the care homes and so forth. So one of the things that I loved was that we could hear the birds, and going to the park, there was no trash. And the day after the pandemic, the lockdown ended, there was wall-to-wall trash in Kensington Gardens again. But the attitude toward disabled people has gotten worse and worse. What do you think that's about?
Elif?
In times of division, we look for scapegoats. We look for people who are slowing us down. If we have this concept of, a certain type of progress, and it's not happening, we start looking for scapegoats. Not only stereotypes against people with disabilities, but also against minorities increased at a moment like this. And I think we've seen horrible xenophobic attacks, especially against Asian Americans, for instance, in America. None of that is a coincidence. So that's why I'm saying we can go backwards before we know it. There's no guarantee that we will go forwards. And we all need to care about human rights, women's rights, minority rights. And we need to empower people who are disempowered. I think the emphasis has to be on the periphery of the society. Whoever has been disempowered, pushed to the margins, disadvantaged, should be given more voice if we want proper equality.
So that moment of solidarity you talked about at the beginning must remain. Okay, so we need to end it here. So thank you so much, Elif, Tim, and Timothée.
And thank you.
And the next debate, you will
yes,
tell us.
And thank you to the chair, Agnès Poirier, of course. Clearly, an amazing debate. Clearly, what's essential is meeting and gathering and talking like this. That has been what we've been missing, and it's absolutely essential. Also essential, if you have some essential questions more, there is book signing. I've just given you some book signing to do, but we need to buy their books. They're at South Kensington Bookstore. It's on a table down in the foyer, and I'm sure they'll take some more questions down there. Meanwhile, Agnès Poirier, Elif Shafak, Tim Waterman, and Timothée Parrique, au revoir. Là. Merci. We'll be back in 10 minutes in here if you've booked.